This is a walnut from my grandmother's walnut tree. Today I'm going to speak about some podcasts, and I would dare to compare a podcast to a walnut. A podcast has its title and its cover, and we get its value only by listening to its inside. The good part of a walnut is also on the inside, and it is that nut that is very tasty from these natural trees. And our job as listeners of podcasts is to find the best sources of these podcasts, the best trees of them, the best trees of walnuts, which in this case would be the best podcast channels. In order to save some time for you, and if you like to gain more value out of this world by listening to some podcasts, and today we are going to take a look at the inside of some podcasts. I will provide you a top 3 and a top 1. Of course, I will not say anything negative about those podcasts because already I am choosing from the top ones. So immediately all of the podcasts that I will be mentioning, they are worth a watch. But I will be sharing the best ones and the ones that you should not miss. Before that, though, I would like to share with you a few tips for these podcasts. You should listen to them when you are doing some other task. For example, if you're driving, if you are waiting for something, and if you're doing some cardio, if you are preparing some food, doing some cleaning, for all of these simple tasks. Of course, you can also dedicate your full attention to that podcast. But now, why would you if you can do multiple things at once? Because it is important that we are not here to memorize every single thing that was said in the podcast. We are here to listen to that thing and to take out the things that hit the right spot, the things that made us think about something. We are not here to learn, but rather to find things to apply in our own lives from those podcasts. And as you can see from this graph, the number of listeners is just growing and growing. And not all of these people are actually getting and listening to the valuable podcasts. And my job through these series will be to provide you with a short list of the best podcasts. Keep in mind, though, that the recommended podcasts from my side will be related to self-improvement. You can see all of my podcasts. I've listened to 9 of them this last week. I've chosen the 3 best ones, but I will leave them to the end and I'll begin with the rest of them. Let's begin with the Sans Permission one. Well, this podcast is a French one, so you can basically only watch it if you understand French. I would say that this is the top podcast for someone that wants to get some entertainment and some value in the same time. Starting with a random one from this list, let's take the Diary of a CEO. This channel is one of the best ones for podcasts. I would highly recommend this. In this podcast, he was interviewing a coffee expert, James Hoffman, a professional barista, and they talked a lot about coffee, and it wasn't that much of a scientific discussion, but more of a discussion about the background and the culture towards coffee. It was very interesting. I did enjoy it. I learned a few more perspectives that I could have around this coffee. Before, I always thought that it was just for caffeine, for energy, but I also learned that you can simply bond with other people while drinking some coffee, going to some coffee shops, local ones if possible. It is the Colombian origin coffee is the best one. At least that's what this person is saying. And if you want to learn about the scientific side of coffee and specifically caffeine, you should also watch the Huberman podcast in which he examined all of the causes of caffeine. The other podcast of the Diary of a CEO that I listened to as well was with Jordan Peterson. This podcast talked mainly about relationships, traumas, about communication, about the truth as the foundation of your life and as the priority. It also talked about the negative effects of lies, about hell, and all of that. And it's kind of a complex podcast to understand, but it is a good addition to all of the psychology realm and to all of the other podcasts that Jordan Peterson has done. If you like this guy, if you enjoy his mindset and his lessons, you should definitely not miss this podcast. The other podcast that I listen to is from Mike Thurston. His channel of podcast is called First Things First. In this podcast, he interviewed a person named Adil Khan, if I am pronouncing that correctly, and they talked about rehabilitation, about anti-aging, about peptides, red light, supplements. But this person doesn't have that powerful of an aura that another guy named Gray Becca, for example, has. Here I mentioned a video of his where a Yomi Denzel, a successful entrepreneur, interviewed him and they talked about a similar theme to this one. This podcast would mainly benefit the more wealthy. The tips related to all of this biohacking are mainly for people that have the resources and the money to get some. And if you simply follow all of the basics and you try to live healthy, you can achieve 80%. And that extra 20%, that's where you would try to optimize your health to the maximum. And that's where this biohacking would intervene. Another big biohacking podcast that the Diary of a CEO has released not long ago was with Brian Johnson. You probably already heard of this guy. And if you like him, you can listen to this podcast as well. We got this podcast about nutrition essentially, and it was Max Lugavere who talked about some nutritional benefits. This podcast can mainly be an addition to other podcasts that were also related to nutrition. For example, this podcast from the Diary of a CEO, where this Chris Van Tulekin also talked about nutrition and all of that. I would say that this podcast had even greater quality, the one of the Diary of a CEO. But if you are interested about nutrition, you should listen to both of these and you will gain so much more in insights about nutrition, what is healthy, and what food should you pursue and why. Another podcast from Chris Williamson is with Jim Quick that I listened to today. Personally, I did not gain much from this one, even though it talks a lot about memory and the brain itself. I would say if you haven't listened to any podcasts on the subject before, this podcast can be definitely valuable to you. It looks at the basics of all of these things and also digs into some of the sub themes of the subject. Next to this podcast, I would also recommend another podcast from the Diary of a CEO, which by now you can see that I refer to very often because it is a very, very valuable podcast. And now, approaching the top 3 podcasts of the week. Let's begin by another podcast of Chris Williamson. And this one was about some psychology with Morgan Housel. This podcast had a lot of value. It talked about prediction and how it works in humans. This prediction also is not accurate within us because we cannot predict surprises, and those surprises, those are the ones that usually make the biggest impact. And that's why we cannot really know what is going to happen next, what the future will look like. We can only speculate. He talked also about what is happiness, and he posed a simple equation in which he stated that happiness is simply the expectations minus the out. Almost to the end. Another very interesting podcast which I listened to was the one of Tim Ferriss about meditation, and he interviewed Dr. Willoughby Britton. They talked about his meditation, and this podcast has a lot of data and insights about meditation, what it actually is and what are its causes. It also related a lot with psychedelics, with fasting, and with other extreme ways of meditating. At this very moment, YouTube is very saturated with all of the self-improvement content. And most of these YouTubers actually preach to meditate to everyone. They say that it can only be positive. But this podcast proves them wrong. And meditation can sometimes be negative to you. It is also important to note that the main goal that our society created around meditation is to make us calmer, but we can create plenty of other goals with meditation, and that calm state might not be as natural as we think for some people. That meditation can be also dangerous for some of us, specifically for those that experience a lot of trauma, and simply being in that of a calm state with your mind that is completely free and can race around any thought, this can be very dangerous. The moral of this podcast would have been that meditation can have negative consequences for you, and you should always take it slow, monitor the consequences of your meditation, begin by a little, grow from there, and see how you feel. And now the last podcast, the one that takes the star for this week, the one that had the most value to me, was the one of Andrew Huber. In this specific podcast, he talked about a protocol of a journaling that should work around your traumas and fix your life, fix your mental health. It has this type of journaling has a specific protocol. You can check it out on the podcast itself. This journaling has over 200 studies on it, which all prove that it is very efficient on trauma managing. I've tried it myself, and it helped me tremendously. I've done all of the 4 times. I've done them consecutively, and I learned a lot about myself. I looked at my past, looked at my traumas, even though I basically don't have any of them, but I have a lot of negative experiences. And from these negative experiences, I managed to connect them all to the start. And that way, I managed to figure out what were my biggest issues and how I should work around them. So that was it for today's video and for today's podcast review. You can find this exact Notion page with all of the descriptions of these podcasts in the description down below. Enjoy your time, and if you have some free time, take it for listening to some of these or some other podcasts that you find very valuable. I'll see you next week with some new podcast ideas.